So Esau's blessing is always a very interesting, an interesting part of the Bible for me, and part of the lectures and the principles for me, because because I'm an older brother myself, but I kind of feel that emotion from Esau, that kind of desperation almost in finding out he has no blessings from his father, and he's asking his father for a blessing, and his father's only blessing is serve your brother, right? Until you can't do it anymore, basically, right? So it's a very it's relevant to what I want to speak about today, but it's actually kind of an emotional moment in the Bible. And obviously the outcome of that is Esau is so angry he wants to kill his brother, right? So even that one blessing from his father he can't accept, which was to serve his brother. And so instead he wants to kill him, right? And that is kind of a crucial part of the principles understanding of the process of restoration, right? It's through that feeling of incredible resentment and anger that Jacob has to overcome that and win back the love of his brother. And the other incredibly emotional story is when they then reconcile and Jacob and Esau embrace and they love each other. And it's one of the most important moments in history because it's the first time two brothers centered on God come together and reconcile and restore this feeling of hatred and resentment. So the reason I kind of am starting with that story is I wanted to talk about kind of practical problems that exist in our world, right? And there's something I believe very strongly, and I've kind of always believed growing up, is that by practicing the principle, we should be able to be the ones who are able to resolve some of the most difficult problems in the world, right? That the principle, if true, which I believe it's true, should be the guide to how to make the world a better place. And in order to make the world a better place, there's a lot of problems that we can see all around us that we have to be able to resolve and to solve, right? And it can be a little disheartening sometimes because we look around and even in our own movement, there's division, right? We have different groups even now within the movement. There's a lot of internal conflict, let's say. And sometimes even if we just look at our own communities, our own family, right? There's um, there's tension, there's conflict, there's fighting, right? So the question is, well, then how can we, if it's so hard to solve these small problems, right? How can we solve the bigger problems? How can we solve something like Israel and Palestine, right? Which is something that is an important topic, and I kind of want to talk about it a bit today. I don't think we're going to be able to solve Israel and Palestine in a short Sunday service, but I think it's such an important topic because it's influencing and impacting kind of the conversations and the politics of basically kind of every country in Western Europe, in the Middle East, and probably even further afield than that, right? Um, so so I think what is the principal view of something like the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? What is God's view? And it's something I'm kind of trying to understand and trying to reflect on because, again, like I'm saying, we're struggling ourselves sometimes to bring unity. And something that came up actually this week is there was a very close friend of mine actually sent out this kind of open letter. And it turns out now he's the president of Hyunjinim's organization, the oldest brother. And he sent out this letter that was basically accusing mother of all these things. And it hurt because he's my friend, right? That we're very close. I've been to his house. His wife made me a wonderful dinner. He has a bunch of kids, you know. We stayed up chatting for like 3 or 4 hours. So he was my first room leader when I went to Korea when I was 12. Like there's a deep kind of connection. but I felt like I had to reply to him, right? I had to kind of defend my own belief and my own faith. And so it was a very I was thinking about it a lot because it was kind of I still wanted to keep the connection, right? I didn't want this issue to make us enemies or to destroy our friendship. So I was trying to figure out, how do I word it in a way? How do I express how I feel without breaking that genuine connection and that genuine bond? And maybe I failed because he hasn't written me back, but like, because I was like, I can't compromise what I believe. And that's the conflict in a way. But I also still love this brother and his family, right? And I still want us to be able to meet, and even if we disagree on critical parts of our faith, um, I feel like that the relationships should supersede that, right? Somehow. Um, so it's so again, um, it can be disheartening in a way, but I kind of think of it the other way as well, in that, well, actually, that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's the practice of restoration, is that the default is the conflict. We didn't create the conflict, we didn't build the conflict, but we're trying to resolve the conflict, right? And so the practice of the principled life, the practice of following the principle, is trying to resolve these conflicts. And so they have to come up, or they're already there. It's not like we're creating the conflict, but we're trying to solve the conflicts, right? And that's what makes it so challenging. And that's what makes it a kind of constant, let's say, practice of faith, is that it's an existing problem. And that's kind of how I try to frame it and try to understand it. Because I think it's a more optimistic view, and I tend to try to be a more optimistic person. But yeah, I think that there's parts of the principle that really give us an incredible advantage when we look at conflict and we try to frame conflict and understand conflict. And again, the reason I started with the Esau and Jacob story is I feel like that's such a powerful example of the principle explaining something that just sounds like a weird story to a lot of people. Like Christianity and Islam haven't really been able to frame that story in a way that really gets to the depth and the kind of importance of that moment, right? And another one I think is very critical and is a really good example of this is Abraham's sacrifice of, or almost sacrifice offering of Isaac, right? And this is also a story in the Bible that's very, very controversial, right? And the way Christians interpret it is kind of like a precursor to Christ, right? The Christian view of everything in the Bible is it's all an example of Christ, right? So uh, Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, but God provided a lamb or a ram. And so that was the substitute. And so then that's a symbol of Jesus being the Lamb of God and a substitute for us who we should sacrifice. So again, but a very controversial story, and people who criticize Christianity and criticize God always say, "Oh, look, God believes in child sacrifice, right? You know, it's an example of child sacrifice. That's what God is asking Abraham to do." And I think a critical part of the principle is to be able to explain what this story really means, how critical this moment is in history for God. And because of Abraham's initial failure and the context of like the foundation of faith and the foundation of substance, that God needed this to succeed. If Abraham failed, the suffering and the continuation of the providence would be so heartbreaking that God was desperate in that moment, right? That God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac was an act of desperation. It was the only way to save the providence. It isn't what God wanted to do. Um, and also the critical element. And what's interesting is because I was researching how the Muslim world views the story of Abraham offering versus the Christian world, right? Is actually the Quran explanation of the story is much more, let's say, clear about Isaac's role. In the Quran, Abraham asks Isaac directly, "Look, God told me to do this. What do you think?" And Isaac was if God told you, then let's follow God's will, right? The Bible kind of hints at that a bit. It does also explain Isaac accepted it, right? And so again, the principle makes it very clear that that offering required both of them to make it, right? That Isaac had to accept the offering for God to accept it. And um, if Isaac hadn't accepted the offering, one, I don't think Abraham would have been able to go through with it anyway, because I think it was already so difficult to Abraham that if he got any resistance, he would have just decided not to do it, right? So the point is that offering was 100% the success of not just Abraham, but Isaac. And that's a really crucial element of the story that Christianity misses, because Christianity kind of misses personal responsibility a little bit easier, right? Um, but again, through the understanding of the divine principle, through the understanding of the purpose of history, the kind of build up and the foundation that needs to be made, the story can actually make a lot more sense, and it makes sense in context as part of this almost desperate attempt for God to kind of end human suffering, to get to a point where he can send the Messiah and start to establish a godly people, right? The other interesting thing about this story with Abraham and Isaac, right, is the majority of the Muslim world believes that it was Ishmael that was offered. But it's not set in stone, and that's what I found very interesting. The Quran doesn't mention a name, and so it's almost like a theological discussion among Muslim scholars of whether it was Isaac or Ishmael, right? Which is also kind of a very fascinating kind of dynamic and kind of, let's say, spiritual or emotional connection to the story, right? Because the Islamic world actually has a holy day for that offering of Ishmael, right? And for those of you who aren't familiar, Ishmael was Abraham's first son, right? That was through his handmaiden at the request of his wife, because his wife felt she couldn't have kids. And then um, when Abraham's wife, Sarah, actually got pregnant and had a child, obviously she was very, very jealous of the firstborn son that wasn't hers. And she kind of demanded that they be kicked out and leave, right? So there's this kind of very kind of real emotional impact or trauma from these experiences, right? And then Ishmael was, in tradition, the ancestor of the Arabs and the Arab world, and also a direct ancestor of Muhammad, right? So Ishmael is a very crucial, critical, central figure in the Islamic faith and the Islamic belief. And so the majority of Muslims believe actually Abraham blessed Ishmael through that offering, right? Hagar was the mother of Ishmael, yes. And so again, it reminds me of this Esau begging for the blessing, right, of his brother, right? And in a way, it's like the Muslim world wanting God's blessing, right? And through Ishmael, we're blessed, right? Instead of what happened according to the biblical story, they were just kicked out, right? Now, Abraham didn't want to kick out Hagar and Ishmael because Ishmael was his son, but God told him that it's okay and I will take care of them. But essentially, all he did was give them a bottle of water and kick them out into the desert. And then Hagar got to a point where she was sure they were both going to die. And so she just put her son under a tree and walked away because she didn't want to see it. So again, a very like traumatizing experience. And then God spoke to her and said, I will take care of you, and kind of led them to water. So that's the biblical account, right? And again, the biblical account kind of makes no sense in like our modern understanding. It just seems like people are being mean to each other, right? But in reality, um, the Ishmael and Isaac dynamic was meant to be the Cain Abel dynamic if Abraham had succeeded in the first offering, right? So again, Ishmael was in this position to kind of like Esau was, right? And that is kind of the origin story in a way of the Muslim world and the Christian world, right? Especially Judeo-Christian world. The Jewish ancestry comes directly from Isaac to Jacob. Jacob's name becomes Israel, right? And then Ishmael is the ancestor of Muhammad and the father of the Islamic world, right? So in kind of the history of these two people, you have this kind of traumatic family story that kind of is, it's not the root cause of the conflict, but it's a very, very clear example of these conflicts happening on a very small level initially, right? And kind of ballooning out of control through time and aggregation and a continuation of these type of actions to be where we are today, right? But the truth is, going back to Israel and Palestine, that's not why they're fighting each other. That's the maybe the origin story. But the real story is much, much more complex, much, much more real in the sense that it's real human experience, right? The people who live in Gaza today, in Israel today, they have living memories of things that have happened to them that make them resentful, make them hate each other, make them angry, and make them willing to kind of fight and go to war. And the reason I mention this point about personal like experience causing resentment, right, is Esau's emotion there in that quote is his personal feeling, right? You can read it in the text how much it's impacting his heart directly, right? It's not something disconnected from him as a person. He's really hurt, and that hurt then causes his reaction. It causes the resentment, right? And Ishmael and Hagar's rejection from the family uh, is something very personal, right? It's very traumatic and it's very real in that, Hagar was ready to die basically, and she just felt helpless in that moment, right? And think about then how that story goes as they grow up. What does Hagar tell Ishmael about his father and about this family over there that kicked us out, right? It creates this very difficult, genuine resentment. And the reason I'm mentioning this is when we think about Israel and Palestine, I think it's important to remember that the feelings of people are personal. It's their own direct experience. It's not some nebulous, like, we lived here 2,000 years ago and they're trying to take the land from us. That's kind of the words people use. It's kind of the political terminology. Or they want to wipe us out. River to the sea means that, they don't want any Jews to live in this area. But in reality, I really believe that the actual resentment is personal. And I think that's just an important point for us to understand is that it's my family was killed, or my friend was killed. Like these are personal experiences that people have. I think that's why it's one of the reasons it's so difficult to change and so difficult to heal, because it's very, very deeply embedded in a personal way. And then those other points, the political points, the historical points, the religious points, they get kind of layered on top as a justification for why it's okay to be that angry. It's okay to be that resentful, right? But the reason I'm emphasizing the personal experience is because that's really, to me, one of the cores of the principle is that conflict doesn't start on a government level. It doesn't start on some devious plot from a group of people in a room, but the conflict is already there in our own hearts, in our own experience, right? In our own interactions with people. So the question I'm always asking myself, and it's very hard to answer, is then which side is God on, right? Or what's God's view, right? And which side is God's on is always an easy question to answer in some ways. God's on my side, right? My side's the righteous side, right? So God is on my side, always, of course, right? Why would I be on a side against God anyway? That would be stupid to go against God, right? So you get into the kind of contradiction of every sports player thanks God for winning, right? So God was on the winning side always, right? It'd be interesting if some sports player thanked God for losing, right? Saying, I'm grateful to God because losing is a good experience and I've learned how to be a better player. And right, that's maybe they just don't get interviewed. Maybe that's how they feel when they get home. But so the point is like, obviously if we switch wars a bit, Ukraine and Russia, right? Maybe the Russians are gods on our side, the Ukrainians are gods on our side, right? But definitely in Palestine and Israel, definitely in other conflicts, um, God is always on my side, right? But that's kind of the problem, right? That's kind of the core of the issue is God's side is not either side. And it's not that either sides are equally righteous or equally wrong or equally right. It's that God genuinely doesn't care, right? Which side is more righteous. And I think almost every parent will have this experience when two of the kids are fighting. You genuinely don't care who started it or why the fighting happened. You just want them to stop fighting, right? That is, to me, I've had that direct emotional reaction at least 100 times, right? I think every parent has had that direct feeling at least 100 times. I don't care who started this. I don't care who's more right or more wrong. You guys shouldn't be fighting, right? And so I think ultimately it's this parental heart of God that is so powerful in conflict, and for us to understand that there's no right side really if people are dying, if people hate each other. There is no right side, right? And it's not both sides, it's not making it equal, but it's like if we're trying to understand God's heart, I think the easiest way to express God's heart is what's the fastest way to stop this, to stop the suffering, to stop this war, to stop this injustice or this suffering, right? And I don't think that means God's always like um, that there can never be war in history, right? Because obviously there were times when going to war was the fastest path to end suffering, right? If you think about World War II, what's God's view on the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I don't know, right? I'm not saying I know for sure or I know the answers, but in that equation, it's very hard to know if one action causes more or less suffering. But what I do know is that God didn't want people to hate each other after. And I think one of the major successes of World War II is that actually the US went in and almost tried to take care of Japan. And it's something that I always find very fascinating about General MacArthur's autobiography is he went into Japan and he basically he replaced the emperor. He became the supreme ruler of Japan, military dictator for like 12 years. And he really was, he was a very devout Christian, and he had this view that we have to raise these people up. We have to educate them. We have to help them become their best selves. So he gave women the right to vote. He really pushed forward all these changes that kind of lifted up the Japanese culture and experience to be one where they just kind of took off and they became an economic powerhouse. They're one of the most egalitarian countries in the world, and it just became a completely almost different country from the war-focused country before World War II. It doesn't mean everything he did was probably correct. It doesn't mean it was like there weren't any mistakes or that relationship was perfect. But it also reminds me of Father's autobiography when he talks about he was fighting the Japanese, right? He was in the resistance. He was against the Japanese. But as soon as the war ended, Father was actively helping like protecting Japanese from getting hurt by the resentful Koreans that were then trying to, a lot of Japanese were killed or hurt during that time of transition. So, same with the Germans in World War II. The problem with World War I is when Germany lost, all the countries penalized them so heavily that the country couldn't recover. They were just suffering, and it just basically bred more hatred and resentment. But at the end of World War II, the attitude was, let's invest in Europe, let's invest in Germany, let's include in Germany in the rebuilding of Europe. And it's a completely different history because of that. Like the countries we have now, the peace and prosperity we have now come from this much more principled attitude of, we fight the war, we win the war, and then we don't hate the losers, we lift them up, right? So that's not an easy thing to do, especially in something, like I said, I don't have an answer for Gaza and Israel. It's something I talk about a lot with some people, not with everyone, because it's too sensitive a topic. And it's something I genuinely care about and feel helpless about. And I think a lot of people feel helpless about the situation there. Um, but what can we do? And I always come back to this idea that kind of the best thing we can do is try to be the voice of God's heart, the voice of this heart of like, even if you feel you have to do something to solve a problem, the actions might be right, they might be necessary, but the heart has to be, once you've accomplished that, what are you doing next, right? How are you lifting up these people? And Israel has a lot of reasons for why they're going about the war in Gaza the way they are. But do they have any plan? Do they have any artistic philosophy or concept that if they succeed, what will they do next? Will they invest in Gaza? Will they raise up the country and give people a path of kind of prosperity and forgiveness and a feeling of being protected and loved, right? And I don't think that's the case, right? And I think that's why part of the reason the problem never gets solved, it kind of becomes an endless cycle of violence, right? And again, Israel and Palestine is one of the most visible areas where this happens, but this happens in a lot of parts of the world. There's many countries that are in this never-ending cycle of kind of violence and abuse and corruption. So, yeah, so my conclusion is always the best we can do is try to explain this part of God's heart and see if there's any applicable way to apply that, and make that a cultural way of thinking and make that an argument that can kind of spread and maybe gain traction, right? Maybe the only solution for Israel and Palestine is to completely separate them, right? For like a decade or something, somehow, right? There's like a parent coming in and separating two kids and like both of you cool down, take 10 years to forget why you're so mad at each other and then try again. But again, that might not even work. There's no practical way to do it, but it's just like what can be done, right? It's such a painful thing to see. And then you can imagine how painful it is for God to see it, right? God's not happy, like he doesn't have a side there, for sure. And that kind of, there was one other point I wanted to kind of mention here, and I kind of alluded to it with that resentment is personal, right? People feel personally wronged and personally justified, right? And I think a lot about, in the principle, we talk about collective sin, right? And then we talk about personal responsibility. I've always struggled a little bit with that slight contradiction, right? Why am I personally responsible for things that not even my ancestral sin I can understand, if it was my great, 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 great grandfather, I'll take some responsibility for that, right? I'm sure he was an awful person sometimes, whatever his name was, right? But because people were awful, people still are awful and hopefully getting better. But the collective part, I get a little defensive about, right? Like, well, it wasn't my ancestors that did it, so why do I have to take responsibility? And I think it comes back again to this point of it's very human nature as we have very personal resentment. But if we can't resolve that with the person we're resentful to, it kind of naturally expands to everything connected to that person, right? So again, if you think of Israel and Palestine, if you're a Gazan family and let's say your parents died in a war, right? You don't know which soldier like shot your parents or dropped the bomb. You don't have a personal person to even reconcile it, right? You don't have a person to understand why they did it or have a conversation about. You only have the whole state of Israel, right? It's the only kind of focus for your resentment, for your anger, and then it's very easy to expand that to well, all Jewish people, right? Something I really don't accept and I counter is the idea that the Gazan people are anti-Semitic, right? And I'm like, no, they're not anti-Semitic. They just hate anyone that has anything to do with their suffering, right? It's a completely different reason. It's a different rationale, right? So, um, and so I think that's what turns into collective sin is that if people are resentful to me because I'm part of a group, then I have an opportunity to somehow try to heal that resentment, right? Um, and it reminds me, Father gave this kind of really beautiful story or hypothetical example of how to heal racism in America, right? He says, if you're a white person and you're racist and you kind of learn that you kind of change your heart, how do you overcome the kind of racist actions you might have done? And he says you should find like the poorest African American woman you can and offer her, buy her a meal and kind of repent to her and, you know, repent with tears to her, for the heart you had and the attitude you had. And I think that's a really, now in a way that's personal sin. The guy himself was racist in the example. But I think there's something there about, taking personal responsibility to heal resentment. Because it doesn't matter if you're not the cause of the resentment. If the person is resentful to you, there's an opportunity to heal that resentment, right? Um, so it's just something I was thinking about. What does collective sin mean? And sometimes I turn sin and resentment. I have this feeling that they're very connected, right? When you're resentful to people, or when you've caused resentment yourself, you could call that sin, right? So the resentment you've caused is your sin. The resentment people have towards you is still your sin, and that's why collective resentment exists, right? Um, so anyway, so I wanted to kind of mention that in the context of like trying to solve these problems, right? Is that I think there's a lot of scenarios where we're not personally responsible. It's not our fault, but there's an opportunity where we can heal resentment because people are resentful to us because of our um, collective identity or something, right? But I think the healing has to always be done on an individual level. I think that's what makes it so hard because it's so much easier to blame Israel or blame Hamas or say, uh, the people in Gaza hate the Jewish state, all of them or 80% of them. It's much harder when there's a person in front of you who you can have a conversation with and you can understand their suffering. It's much harder to actually believe those things about them or to have that attitude. So I think my conclusion is, I'm always optimistic because I feel like the other option is to be pessimistic, and that's not helpful for anyone, including yourself. So I'm always optimistic because I feel there's always hope. There's always something that we can try to do or make some effort to do. And I think we have such incredibly powerful tools in the principle. The story of Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael and our understanding of it, I think is something that can help people understand God's heart and the historical concept and how to deal with resentment and heal resentment. The story of Jacob and Esau is, one of the most important stories in the Bible. And we understand that because of the principles of restoration and the foundation for the Messiah, but it's not common knowledge. Like most people don't understand how important that story is to solving conflict, to ending resentment, right? Um, so So yeah, my kind of conclusion is as much as possible, because we know the principle, I think we have this ability and this strength to be able to be the voice of God's heart. That's kind of how I wrote it down, right? To help people understand what God would want in every situation. Um, Not from the like self-righteous, God wants what I want, right? But from the principled, God has a heart of a parent. So what is the parental heart in this situation? Um, doesn't mean we'll always get it right, but I think that's the practice, that's the culture we have to try to push into the world somehow. Um, so so yeah, I didn't want to shy away from something like Israel and Palestine. I wanted to really talk about it. I feel we have a unique perspective. I just want to say, so I've been incredibly impressed and proud of like the work UPF and Women's Fed does, not just in Ireland, but also on like the international level around these issues. The last World Summit I went to, I know I shared this, but they had the Balkan leaders talking about Kosovo. And that's a topic I actually know a lot about. And I lived in that area. I speak some Albanian, like I have my own personal views. And it was so great and so helpful even to hear the Serbian former like foreign affairs minister give the Serbian perspective. Even though I completely disagree with it, just to hear him say it made it again a personal connection. Like it was someone I could go up to and talk to, and I could kind of understand his perspective. And it really changed my view of the conflict in a very healthy way, right? So I always give that example because I know UPF and Women's Fed, they're doing that work all the time, right? They're really trying to put the principle into practice. Um, and, maybe we don't see it because we're focused in our local areas and we're trying to make things happen on the local level. But, you know, even the things we did when we could in MEPI, like for Middle East peace, it makes me very proud. It's kind of the example I hope we can get better at of putting the principle into action and trying to bridge these crazy, um, basically walls of hatred. Is the only way I can describe them, right? It's just such a powerful wall, right, in certain parts of the world. So that was kind of my reflections for today. It's definitely a longer service than I usually give, but it's something also I felt I had to share. So appreciate everyone for listening. And if you can join me in prayer, I'll close the service for today. Saramanashin Hanal Bumunim. As we sit here together in this beautiful building of our Irish Heavenly Parents Holy Community, our Irish Family Federation group of blessed families, we're just so grateful that we live at a time and a place where we can come together in relative peace and prosperity. It's so easy to take for granted how blessed we are. But on the other hand, I often feel we should take for granted how blessed we are because this is the way, so much closer to the way it should be. We shouldn't have to be afraid for our lives. We shouldn't be at war or anxious every minute, but we should be able to have fun together and celebrate together and enjoy food and conversation together. So I pray that this kind of blessing that we have is something that the whole world can have and have as soon as possible. It's really the ideal that you had when you created us, a world without suffering, a world of families coming together and uh, to to just share the joy of life and the beauty of life. And if we can strip away the resentment and the fighting and the trauma that exists in every corner of this world, the world is a beautiful place, full of amazing things we can do and together and things we can talk about and experiences we can share. So I hope that's the world we can help build. And of course, we can't do it on our own. We need each other. We need to be centered upon your will. We need to have a clear direction we can move in together. And I pray on all those points we can continue to practice a life of attendance and humility. We can pray for guidance and direction. And this practice and this lifestyle can guide us to be the best version of ourselves. And a version that isn't just benefiting to ourselves, but can then spread to the people around us and the community and societies and nations around us. So I report this with a very grateful and humble heart, in attendance to the Holy Mother Han, and in the name of Youngil, Eli, Loew, a blessed central family. Aju. Aju. All right. On that note, I'll welcome Daniel back up.